program now. J.W. Richards, co-author of the New York Times bestseller Indivisible. And Jay is, Jay, you there with us?
Yes, I'm here. Thanks for having me on.
Tell our listeners what your day job is, brother.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a long-time senior fellow at the Discovery Institute, and I've just taken a new position here in Washington, D.C. as distinguished fellow at a newer think tank called the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics. And so I've written on intelligent design and science issues in the past, but I spend most of my time focusing on questions of morality and economics these days.
How do you qualify as a distinguished fellow as opposed to just a fellow?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I guess after you've written several books, I'm not sure what perks it actually provides, but it's certainly a nice title.
It's a good title. It sure is.
Yeah, and fortunately, I've spent most of my career with a mix of kind of writing and fellow type of responsibilities and administrative responsibilities. And my new position at IFWE, the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics, is primarily a focus on what I really feel called to do, which is to write and speak and do media and things like that. So I'm really excited.
Ray?
Jay, your new book is called Infiltrated. And let me read the subtitle here because it's terrific. How to Stop the Insiders and Activists Who Are Exploiting the Financial Crisis to Control Our Lives and Our Fortunes. That's a mouthful, but you know, if you read that, you kind of get what you're talking about there. How'd you come up with this? And who are these insiders and who are these activists?
Well,
I don't doubt a word you've said. So
yeah, and this is one of these 19th century subtitles that gives you the whole argument, in the single subtitle, and we bounce that around. But there've been so many books on the financial crisis. I mean, we're coming up here on the 5th anniversary of the 2008 financial crisis. And I had been studying it since it happened and reading every book that came out and every article I could find. And there was this official narrative that got established about 2 weeks after the crisis really started, that this was all the result of unfettered competition and capitalism and Wall Street greed and these kind of things. And practically everything I was discovering seemed to suggest that, whatever role Wall Street greed may have played in the crisis, that wasn't the cause of the crisis, and it was really grounded in government policies, especially affordable housing policies. Now, when the crisis happened in 2008, the smoking gun wasn't quite out. We didn't have the numbers in terms of government's role in these so-called subprime and otherwise risky home loans. But as of 2010, because of some work of a couple of guys at the American Enterprise Institute, we now know that on the time of the crisis in 2008, about 27 million risky loans were in the system. That's about half of all the mortgages in the system at the time. And of that 27 million, 2/3 were owned either by government entities like Fannie Mae or by entities that are operating under government control. So obviously Washington had something to do with the subprime mortgage and the housing crisis if it's holding 2/3 of those loans. And that's really what I was interested in. I'm as a kind of philosopher and popularizer of economic topics. That got me into it. What I discovered, though, as I started doing research and confidential interviews, is the role that a lot of people nobody's ever heard of played in this crisis. I mean, you hear about Barney Frank and Chris Dodd, these members of Congress who supported these affordable housing policies, then got their name on the bill that was supposed to fix the crisis caused by the policies. They retired. You've heard of them. Most people haven't heard of a billionaire named Herb Sandler in California, who both benefited from these subprime loans and then has funded left-wing operations that actually supported these policies behind the scenes for years. I mean, there were nonprofit organizations like Self-Help in North Carolina that were privately going to banks and essentially cajoling them into giving risky loans. And they played a key role in that. And these are these insiders and activists. And what's interesting, as I discovered as I was working on this book, a lot of these people not only played a role in the policies that led to the crisis, but they used the crisis as a pretense to increase their own power. And a lot of these people and a lot of these key players that were originally working at some organization like Self-Help in the nonprofit world are now in the government bureaucracies regulating us. And so I just think it's kind of a scandalous story, and it's still part of the story of the financial crisis that most people have never heard.
In other words, you're saying some of the guys who got us into this mess are they're now regulating They're in a position of regulating the economy at this point. That can't be good.
No, it can't. I mean, it's the fox running in the hen house because let me just tell you one story about this guy, Martin Eakes. Martin Eakes is a housing activist, this intelligent guy in North Carolina that started this self-help organization that I mentioned a minute ago. Martin Eakes in 2010 spoke to a group of MBA students at Duke University, and he bragged that the ideas that had just been passed the month before in the Dodd-Frank Financial Reform Act had been thought up basically in his organization in North Carolina, and now they were the law of the land. Now, it was kind of indiscreet, the video's on the internet, so I had access to it, and it caused a bit of a scandal, but still most people don't realize that. But what's interesting is that this same organization now has people in the Federal Reserve, it has people at Treasury, it has people at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, at the FDIC. These are folks that help write these ideas, come up with these ideas. They're now ensconced and in charge of enforcing these things. That's just scary, and most people don't know anything about it.
Talking to Jay Richards about his book called Infiltrated, and here's the subtitle: How to Stop the Insiders and Activists Who Are Exploiting the Financial Crisis to Control Our Lives and Our Fortunes, published by McGraw-Hill. To borrow from Bill O'Reilly, Jay, who in Washington is looking after us? Looking out for us, I should say.
Yeah, well, this is the problem, is that, of course, everything the government does is claimed to be looking out for us. I mean, let's just take that Dodd-Frank bill, the Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Bill. Well, everybody thinks, okay, well, Wall Street needed reforming, and I'm a consumer, and I need protection. So everything they do is supposedly for our own benefit. But I'm reminded of C.S. Lewis's great quote, that a tyranny exercised for the good of its subjects is the worst tyranny of all. And that's, I think, what we have in this situation. I mean, I don't doubt that affordable housing goals and policies that were put in place by both parties over a period of years were well-meaning. They were designed to try to help lower-income people be able to get into homes and own homes. The result of those policies, though, was to degrade and in many cases destroy the underwriting standards that banks had always used on loans, and then create a market for those loans so that if banks gave these risky loans, they wouldn't have to keep them on their books but could sell them to Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. The government literally created a market for risky loans, and the market provided. That's this kind of scandalous story. And so if we're going to think, okay, well, the bill that the government's going to pass is supposed to fix the problem, if we really think that's true, remember that Washington still has not admitted its role in the original problem. So how likely is it that the bill that's supposed to fix it would actually do what it said to do?
Could 2008 happen again? Could we have another housing collapse?
Absolutely. And in fact, it's not quite clear. I mean, we're in what you could call a housing recovery right now. And I can tell you here in the Washington, D.C. area that if anything, there's a housing boom, but I think this is because the federal government's sucking up a lot of money in this part of the country. But let me just give you one example. Prior to the crisis and right after it, everybody heard this idea about too big to fail. Well, it wasn't an official policy, but a lot of large financial institutions, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, were government-sponsored enterprises, but also Lehman Brothers, a big investment bank in New York, headed at the time by a guy named Dick Fuld. They had this sort of attitude that, look, we're so important to the system that we can take risk, and if we succeed, we'll profit. But if we fail, the government's not going to let us collapse. We're too big to fail. Well, that was kind of just a working assumption that I think did play a role in the crisis. Well, as a result of the Dodd-Frank Act in 2010, we now designate certain large banks as systemically important financial institutions, and now we're even doing it with non-financial institutions like insurance companies. Well, systemically important is just a bureaucratic phrase for too big to be allowed to fail. And so what was before kind of working assumption in the market is now official policy.
Talking to Jay Richards, and that's interesting. So the housing market is, I know I've been reading reports that it's on the rebound. I mean, it's coming back now, but you're saying it's still tinkering.
Yeah, and here's an interesting statistic. I mentioned that about two-thirds of those risky loans were held by the government or entities operating under government control prior to the market. Well, if you look at all the loans, so the good prime loans and the subprime loans, before the crisis, government backstopped or sort of guaranteed about 40% of those loans. Today, it's over 87%. So over 87% of all the mortgages in the system are now sort of backstopped by the guarantees of the federal government. And so we just have all the makings for a future and much more massive kind of bailout following a crisis, because we haven't set in place any policies that would prevent what really happened in the crisis in the first place.
Where to get your book, Infiltrated? That's the title of it. Where would you recommend, Jay?
Absolutely. Just go to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and I encourage people to check out the website, which is infiltratedthebook.com. We got a lot of free videos and tips on what people can do about this.
It's called infiltratedthebook.com. That's the website?
Infiltratedthebook.com. That's
okay.
right.
Let me ask you this related to this topic, and I guess I have my tongue in my cheek when I say this, although I don't know exactly when I ask you this question. But I read an article the other day from somebody. I mean, this person followed Wall Street and was an economist, and they said, "Don't worry about debt. America has printing machines, and we can print into infinity if we have to." And so this QE3 or whatever the Federal Reserve has done can be QE37. So
that's right.
As long as America has the printing machines and we're the reserve currency for the world, quit sweating the 17 trillion going skyward. Now, what do you say about that?
Yeah, the problem is, of course, it's true. The government can print money, and so if we get 20 trillion in debt, the government can say, well, we'll just print out $20 million and we'll use that money. The problem is that money is a medium of exchange, and so if you flood the market with a bunch of free dollars like that, you end up devaluing the value of every other dollar. I mean, it would be just as if you imagined if you were in a town and the mayor decided to give everybody in the town a $10,000 voucher to buy a new car. They had to buy it within the city. Well, the first thing that would happen is that car prices would just go through the roof. Well, that was what will happen ultimately if we monetize the debt, as it's called, which is essentially print money to pay the debt. It would create hyperinflation, and suddenly the price of everything would skyrocket.
But isn't that what we're doing now?
Well, it is. And see, the truth of the matter, we're in this weird lull that allows this fellow that you said to say these kinds of things. We're doing it now. We don't seem to see real visible signs of hyperinflation. And the reality is there's a lag on these things. And the fact that the dollar, for instance, is still the reserve currency, it's buying us a little time, because as bad as it is, I mean, it's not like, okay, if you're going to dump the dollar as your reserve currency, what are you going to get? Like Chinese yuan or, euros or, I mean, there's not a lot of better choices. And so that's why I think there's kind of a lag. But ultimately, it's just economic law requires that if you just proliferate dollars of a currency like this in a fiat matter, it's going to lead to huge inflation.
Yeah, but how does it? I don't mean to argue with you. I agree with it. That's sound economic principles you've expounded here. But if everything is relative around the globe, and we are a global economy now, you might say, well, America is going into debt, but hey, it hasn't hurt us yet. And I'm just saying, who's gonna rise above the U.S.?
Yeah, well, that's right. The problem, of course, is that we do have debtors both in the U.S. and elsewhere, and at the moment we can service our debt. See, it's not like we've defaulted, and it's not like we've printed money in order to pay the debt quite yet. We're deficit spending, but we're not quite doing that. And so at some point, I don't think the federal government will ever default on its loans, precisely because it can print money. And so I think at the moment we still are able to service the debt, but at some point the debt will get so high, say in 2020, at the current rate, will require a fifth of the rest of the world's GDP just to service our debt. Well, that can't happen, so something's going to have to give.
Let me ask you one more question related to that.